Hey everybody, just a quick message from me, what lurks beneath here. I wanted to let you all know that I have just very recently joined the Twitch program and I will be doing live stuff on that here fairly soon. So I will leave a link in the description below and you can go and check that out and I will be giving you all more updates on that. What that's going to look like is I'll be getting on there for maybe a half hour to an hour Monday through Friday. I'm not exactly sure the times yet, but I will be taking user requests and reading stories live to all of you. So without further ado, here's the video. Just to start off with some backstory, my group of friends had started making a nasty habit of joking about the Wendigo. My friend Stacy and me didn't for a while, just due to the fact that we believed in the supernatural, but after a few months, it grew on us, not knowing that the Wendigo can actually be triggered by such things. We joined in, which was the biggest mistake ever. I had just moved into the country, and we enjoyed making trips into town to have a few drinks, which is about a 30-minute walk from my place to town. At night, the first 10 minutes after leaving the bridge that leads out of town is pitch darkness with no streetlights. After that, streetlights are very sparsely placed, which can cause for a very creepy walk without anything happening. So, with all that in place, let's continue. Stacy and I began our night, walking into town, get some beers, and have some fun. Shortly into the night, something slightly strange happens. We receive a phone call from her little sister at home, crying and scared because she saw someone sitting on my friend Stacy's bed. She calms her sister down and asks her cousin to check her room for her sister at home. Everything is fine. No one's in the room. Also, ghosts and weird things happening at her house were also very common, so a sighting like this was a very strange regular. We continue our night. Into the night, we meet a guy who seems pretty cool. He's riding a bike and tells us he's pretty drunk or something. We decide to hang out with him for a bit, and wanting to meet people in town. A ways into our hangout, we are sitting on a park bench, and the guy is just lying on the ground in front of us. Suddenly, my friend stands up and says it's time for us to go. I shrug and agree, and we get going. After getting away from him, she tells me the guy bit her ankle. The day after, she said she had teeth bruises on her ankle. Kind of flustered that the guy would do that, we continue our walk out of town. Finally, we pass the bridge, which is our last source of light for the next 10 minutes. We turn on our phone flashlights, and we turn on some music, trying to ease the spooky feeling of being in pitch black darkness in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, we hear a voice beside us, and we both jump. It's the same guy on his bike. He asks us if he can follow us until we reach the fork in the road. We need to go left, and he needed to go right. Still slightly creeped out, but almost at the streetlights and the fork in the road, we agree. Regardless, he had to go the way, so did we. After a bit of walking, we finally reach the fork in the road and the first streetlight. We sigh with relief, hoping he would leave, but he turns down our way instead of going the way he needs to go. And now at this point, we are thoroughly creeped out. We try to ignore it and keep walking, holding our breath, wanting to reach the next streetlight, which in some ways was away. Finally, after what felt like forever, we reach the next streetlight, which is also for some reason a small graveyard. I hate my area. Once we reach the streetlight, the guy stops dead in his tracks and doesn't move any further past it. As we turn around, the guy looks like he has suddenly passed out on his bike, his head down and his shoulders slumped. I was about to say something, but my friend stopped me and said we really needed to leave him. I agreed, not wanting to be around him much long either. After a few seconds, I take a peek over my shoulder. He's gone. Vanished. The worst part is, even if he had turned around and started pedaling as fast as he could, we still would have been able to see him some ways down the road. I panicked, but also slightly relieved he wasn't there anymore. We continue walking, trying to pretend we are not creeped out. Walking quickly from streetlight to streetlight, and finally, we reach my driveway. My driveway is a long road of darkness. We hadn't put any lights in yet to try and brighten it. We began to walk slowly, holding our breath, some weird feeling of dread coming over me the closer and closer we got to my house, and the further into the driveway we entered. I don't know what came over us, but the sudden feeling of, you need to run, and you need to run fast, came over us at the same time. We took off bolting at the exact same time without having to say a word to each other. We got to my front door. I unlocked it quicker than I ever have before, and we get inside. Just as I'm about to close the door, this hellish scream or growl, whatever the sound is, came out of nowhere. I could hear it getting close to the door and steps, so I slammed the door closed and locked it, dropping to the ground in fear. We both sat there, holding our breaths, scared to even breathe. Fast forward a couple weeks. Me and my Stacy had forgotten about what happened. Suddenly, it came up in conversation, and we had tried to find the sound we heard. Nothing worked. We looked up every possible animal, even animals that weren't likely. We spent an hour on this until we decided to look up the sound of a Wendigo. It was the only sound that fit perfectly. We don't joke or talk about it now. I won't. I hate to. Even writing this post made me feel scared to bring it up. Hey everybody, just a quick message from me, what lurks beneath here. I wanted to let you all know that I have just very recently joined the Twitch program, and I will be doing live stuff on that here fairly soon. So I will leave a link in the description below, and you can go and check that out, and I will be giving you all more updates on that. What that's going to look like is I'll be getting on there for maybe a half hour to an hour, Monday through Friday. I'm not exactly sure the times yet, but I will be taking user requests and reading stories live to all of you. So without further ado, here's the video. When I was much younger, I was an avid outdoorsman and a hunter, primarily hunting bear. It's a passion of mine that I loved. I used to hunt black bear mainly, although I had gone grizzly hunting a few times here and there with my cousins up in Alaska. I was on a crazy outdoor trek about a few years ago, fell off a small 30-foot incline and shattered both of my legs. Had I fallen any other way, I would have basically been toast. Thank you, Lord, for that. But that's not why I'm writing to you. When I used to bear hunt, I used to encounter all sorts of beasts being out in the wild. I was born in the city and spent a lot of my time there in my life, and I did not get a hand at taming the wild till I was later in my teens and befriended those who made this way of life. They taught me a lot in a very short amount of time, and I do owe a lot to them. Not only have I encountered Dogman on multiple occasions, but also Bigfoots as well. Both are beasts in their own right, and you want to respect and be very careful of. Both can easily kill you if you're not careful. That's why you need to be respectful to the things around you when you're out there. I mean, I have had instances where I was out tracking this big black bear one time, and I came across these bigger, larger-than-life canine tracks in the soft dirt. This was after I had seen one already, so I didn't take long to figure out what these tracks belonged to. The stride on these tracks, though, had to have been 5 feet easily. Massive prints, bigger than the size of my hand. They went on for maybe 40 yards and disappeared into the thick forest. The most haunting detail that gets me every time is that the prints looked bipedal and not quadrupedal. I knew what it belonged to, but I didn't want to acknowledge these things. I've since come to terms with them, and them living around where I hunted later on. But at that time, it was a tough pill to swallow. Even more so than Bigfoot. At least Bigfoot, there's some sort of introduction to its existence, with the powder film, and just basic general knowledge of Bigfoot in modern-day pop culture. I had never heard of a Dogman at the time, the first one that I saw one. That's why I had a much harder time dealing with it. My first encounter with these things was 2 years after that previous story. I was hunting black bears again, and I had caught the tracks of this one black bear. These tracks led me a little further in the direction of these mountains. I wasn't totally familiar with them, but I didn't think too much of it. After a little ways in, I had these two large, werewolf-looking creatures stalking me from further back up in the trees. Scared the hell out of me. I wasn't going to keep following those bear tracks anymore. I got out of there, and quick. I had no idea what kind of animals I was dealing with, and I wasn't about to be ignorant at the time. You have to understand that these things were huge. At first, they looked like two wild dogs, the size of horses, darting back and forth between the trees. Then, I saw both of them stand up on two legs. Turned me whiter than a ghost. I would continue to run into these same two dogmen in the years to come. That's for another day, though. The next encounter was about 5 months later, when I was out hiking in that part of the woods again, and felt the same feelings as last time, but much more intense. I checked my surroundings, and the scariest thing was that I remembered and recognized the feeling. I just couldn't see them anywhere. That told me that they were already almost up on me, or about to be. I got out of there, not waiting around to find out. I had completely forgotten all about last time until I felt that despicable feeling once again. The memories came flooding right back at the time. That's how I knew. I had a couple of encounters with Bigfoot too, in the very same area, but I never saw any of them at the same time. My Bigfoot encounters were similar, but not aggressive in any way, not like these things. I believe that Bigfoot are much more docile, curious creatures. Not the dogmen, though. I believe they are all full of ill intent, and their auras are so much darker. I believe they were trying to drive me out of their den or territory, whatever it was that I must have come into. It was always that same general area in the mountains every time I would encounter them. I had ventured off into that same area of the mountains more often than not afterwards, and not always had those ominous experiences. I was always equipped with at least a machete and a Glock 45 going back there, just in case anything happened. There's a big river if you travel back far enough. It's quite the scene, but I stopped going back in there after a while. Another time was going back in the mountain range, and I'm pretty sure I ended up sneaking up on one of those things. Came across a large clearing with a large boulder, about the size of a small house, off of about 200 yards away. Crouching on the top, clear as day, was one of those dog creatures I had seen previous. It was clear daytime, and it was no mistaking what it was by its shape. It was not a bear. It was clearly canine by the head and upper body. I could see that it was fixated heavily on something moving off in the trees that I couldn't see. It wasn't moving much either, so I sat there and watched it for moments before moving on in the opposite direction. Hi all. I'm not sure where to start, but I used to drive through one of the reses in my state to go get my therapy appointments, as the freeways were always jam-packed at rush hour. It was a pretty normal thing to do, but I had driven through there one night with my friend to avoid traffic on the way to a party, and they started talking about how their friends avoid the res at night because of the paranormal. My first mistake was to then say out loud, "You mean skinwalkers?" Now, I've always been afraid of spirits or creatures coming after me in the night, but recently, a little over a year later, I am experiencing tapping on my windows and sounds I can't quite explain, as well as visual experiences out my window that I can't explain, like figures moving. I don't know if this is more related to a skinwalker or a wendigo hunting. Hi, I live in Western Australia, and there's been some spooky things happening lately. Not sure if this is a skinwalker or something similar, but figured here would be a good place to ask. Over the past month or so, every night around midnight, my motion detector light goes off outside of my house. I'll peek through the window and see an animal just staring at my home. It's normally a smaller animal, like a cat or dog, but then after a while, it will turn and go away. One night, it happened again, but it wasn't a dog or a cat. It was a man, and he looked like he had a fur cloak on. From what I could see, it was dog fur. I was having a heart attack, but then he started walking towards my house. I immediately closed the blinds, and after a minute or so, opened them again. He was gone, and I saw a cat walking away from my house, going the exact way he had. Is this a skinwalker? Or maybe an Australian version of one? Sorry if this is rough around the edges, I just don't remember it that well. If it happens again tonight, I'll post a new thing about it. My daughter attends the University of Western Florida, and I had just finished getting her settled in her dorm room, stocked up on groceries and other essentials. I left in the late morning and headed back home, which is east of Pensacola, some 3+ hours. All through the first hour or so, there were tremendous rain bands like we are used to here in Florida. As I was traveling on Interstate 10, the trailer trucks would put me up a literal fog of water spray, so I wasn't going more than 50 miles an hour. As I got out of the last rain band, the sky got brighter and brighter to the point where I could get back up to 70 miles an hour. I was still following a car at about 10 car lengths. I checked the rear view and no traffic behind, and I remember looking around the car ahead and nothing for some distance. I was just about ready to pass the white car when he put on his brakes, and I closed distance to him fairly quickly. I braked, also not knowing what was ahead of him. Maybe a truck tire carcass, and he could swerve into my lane as I pass him. Even though I am driving a pickup truck, I ride a motorcycle and sort of drive like I ride, very defensively. As I slowed, I noticed some movement off the road. We were both in the right lane. On the other side of the guardrail, something caught my eye. We had just come over either a swampy area or a small creek, so there was a guardrail over that area. Still, there was a gully between the guardrail and the tree line, maybe 20 feet deep. Almost instantly, I thought bear, but wrong color. Our bear here are jet black, and if they stand, you have the rare chance to see that. They aren't very tall. And the next thought, I thought it was a man in a ghillie suit, but wrong again. This was not material, it was hair. Matted down, wet hair. And the height, maybe 8 feet. It was huge. So, as I saw it, by this time, I was almost stopped. The car ahead directly abeam of the creature and stopped, or very slow. What I saw was a living creature. Everything articulated perfectly. Head, arms, and legs. I had a profile to back view of it, saw its muscles in the upper back. The color wasn't exactly uniform, but varied between shades of chocolate brown. The head looked rounded. I couldn't see ears or a neck, but it definitely had a head, and looked down before stepping into the gully. At that time, I saw arms that moved, but really saw the separate legs, and saw what was matted hair stuck together from the leg. It stepped down, rounded the gully, and out the other side to go into the tree line. Its motion was very smooth, almost like it was gliding. So even if a man could don a suit and act like an 8-foot-tall living creature, how did he manage to walk down a steep embankment that was grassy and wet? Any human would be on his ass or tumble dangerously down that embankment. Anyway, I hurriedly called the wife, who laughed at me for a minute or two, but then realized I was serious. She said, "Get the license plate of the car," which I didn't, and "Where are you?" I was surprised that I hadn't done that at all. Frankly, I think I was just dazed. Well, I know there was somebody else that saw this thing, but that is about all. I would estimate this thing weighed about 400 to 500 pounds. It wasn't fat or barrel-chested. It wasn't skinny either, like it didn't have enough to eat. It was healthy and athletic in appearance, and it sure covered a very difficult area in no time. And by the way, this interstate highway cuts through Eglin U.S. Air Force Base. After hearing stories and looking stuff up online, I'm fairly sure it was a Wendigo. Me, my son, and girlfriend were attacked by something. We were camping up in the northernmost area of Washington state. My girlfriend is incredibly superstitious, so she insisted we brought weapons. So I had my combat knife and a 12-gauge shotgun, and she brought a .22 rifle alongside a newly sharpened machete. Our son was just 3 years old at the time. She and I were set on edge from a park ranger who seemed very tense and uneasy, who stopped us and, instead of confiscating our weapons, told us to be careful and stay safe, then sent us along our way to the camp. When we got there, we were informed that several visitors had spoken about some unnatural noises and a pale creature that would mimic voices and sounds of people who weren't talking or seeming to be distracted. I laughed and put the idea out of my mind, thinking to myself, there's no way. They're fucking with us. But I knew better. So, we then reached the area we were going to set up camp. We immediately got a fire ready to light and set up our tent and bags. I fed my son as my girlfriend ate a snack. We decided to get a lay of the area, so me and my girlfriend hiked around for about an hour or so. I had one of those baby-carrying backpacks, and my son started getting real heavy. Everything seemed normal until I saw something down the almost path we were on. We walked closer to investigate and saw drag marks. It looked as if somebody had killed a buck. There was a hole outlined in the dirt with a small dried pool of blood, as if someone grabbed it from the antlers and pulled. That wouldn't be possible for any man. The buck, or whatever it was, would have been way too big for that. Shaken, we rushed back to base camp and restarted the fire and hurried back into our tents. Too afraid to leave since it was dusk by now, and we stayed inside the tent, and my girlfriend and I put our son to bed. Eventually, probably from the exhaustion of fright, we fell asleep. What must have been hours later, I awoke to a faint rasping sound that sounded like a child crying. I gazed outside in confusion and saw the outline of a creature that seemed to be a buck, standing over something. It seemed to be about 20 feet away, but at a closer glance, had unnaturally long limbs for a buck, and was eerily tall. In sudden fear, I unloaded 2 shots into the creature and heard a loud blood-curdling cry. My girlfriend awoke screaming to the shots I had fired as I tried to explain what I had heard. To my surprise, the animal hadn't moved an inch. Then, I noticed the stains on the side of the animal. It looked like blood was running down the edge, and lots of it. It stared at me, deep into my eyes, as I became petrified with fear. A sinister feeling of dread fell over me, as if I knew I couldn't move. I thought to myself, what if it starts to bolt towards us? Just then, this tall, decrepit, demonic thing seemed to whisper something. I couldn't exactly tell you what it was saying, but it seemed to have said, I need more children. My girlfriend screamed, asking where our son was. We blacked out. In the morning, we awoke to park rangers at our campsite. We didn't see our son anywhere. We told the rangers that he was missing, and they started a search party. I explained what happened, and strangely, they seemed to believe us. The one who seemed to be older by at least a decade pulled along the one we met earlier and whispered something in his ear. I only heard a single line, and I'm not even sure if what I heard was correct. It sounded like he said, "It's getting bolder." They didn't seem to want us by ourselves, so they waited with us while they continued the search. We stayed in a log cabin for 3 days with a forest ranger, when suddenly, some rangers came into the cabin saying they could not find our son. My girlfriend started to sob, and I started to hate myself, thinking that I could have done something if I wasn't frozen in fear. We rushed outside only to find some injured and frightened police officials. The rangers wouldn't tell us anything of what happened or what they saw, or why the cops were scared shitless. All we know is that we don't have a son anymore. I will never recover from this. This happened this summer of 2016. I was staying at my grandparents' house for just a few weeks in the summer while my mother was on vacation. They live near Grand Junction, Colorado. Their house is by a large river, and the whole area has a shit ton of trees, plant life, and animals. I was letting my dog out to go potty one night, and there's hardly any lights around their property, so I grabbed a flashlight. My dog is outside for maybe a minute before I hear her start viciously growling and barking like I've never heard before. She's growled and barked at animals or people outside before, but this was more aggressive than I'd ever heard her. I start making my way over to my dog to investigate. I make it about halfway to my dog, and I freeze dead in my tracks. I'm pointing my flashlight in the direction she's facing, and I see the most unsettling thing I've ever seen. At first, I think I'm just imagining it, or tripping out, but there was no denying it. It was clear as day. What I was looking at was about 3 to 4 feet tall, a rectangular figure, but with rounded edges. Imagine like a 4-foot tall Twinkie. It was this gross, translucent tan flesh color, like the color of a naked mole rat. There was no apparent face or limbs. All I saw was a bunch of tentacle leg-looking things protruding all the way down the front and side of its body. The way it was moving was creepy. At first, it was sort of gently rocking side to side, and then I swear it started taunting my dog, like running from one spot to another, just to mess with her. At this point, I got too scared, and it would do something to my dog, so I ran to her, snatched her up, and booked it inside and locked the door. When I peeked back outside, the thing was gone. I don't think anything has ever disturbed me that much in my real life. My body wouldn't stop shaking for probably 25 minutes after I got inside. The most messed up part is the next day I told my aunt that I saw a weird alien bug-looking creature outside the night before. She then said, "I've seen some weird shit out here too," and proceeded to explain seeing the exact same thing I saw. Same color, shape, lots of tentacle, centipede-looking appendages. And the icing on the cake for me was when she said it kept rocking from side to side. I said, "You're kidding me. That's exactly what I saw last night." We both got chills and flipped out because it confirmed it was not our imagination, but reality. It was summer in 2011. I was exploring with a friend. I had lived in Portland, Oregon at the time, and this friend of mine lived down in Central Oregon, out in the middle of nowhere, where there's dilapidated buildings, lots of desolate farmland. Not much out there, really. Took a trip out to his place and got bored pretty quickly. We wanted to go out exploring and check out everything around, but some of the old homesteads in the area weren't exactly safe. But that's what drew us to it. My friend hadn't actually explored the area much beyond what our eyes would show around his house. I thought this would have been the perfect evening to go wandering out in the middle of nowhere with a joint and just 2 guys out on an adventure. Well, I ended up forgetting the joint in my car, so we just went without. We went a few miles away from his house to several different old homesteads, all dilapidated, worn down, hadn't been used in years. Nothing but desolate farmland around. This was in the summer, so it was arid, dry, and hot. We checked out 3 homesteads that weren't far apart in the same area. We loved the character of each one. In fact, my friend, being the photography buff he is, brought out his camera, and we did some really sick portfolio shots. Anyway, we saw this huge rundown barn next to a corn mill off in the distance. Further away from his house than we already were, we decided to end the adventure after going down there and taking some cool portrait shots. As we approached this old barn, this place was truly massive. We walked around and tried to get some really good shots, but my friend noticed his camera was really acting up all of a sudden. Both of our phones were too. Not turning on, showing we had a dead battery when both had been nearly fully charged before we even left. Things like that. It was strange. I should probably mention how bad the smell was in this barn. Not only was it an old, musty old barn, but it reeked like wet dog. It was terrible. I think after hanging around for maybe 20 minutes, my friend mentioned to me we should cut things short and head back. I don't think he was feeling well. He told me he started feeling really run down all of a sudden, and just didn't feel good. My stomach felt knotted up, and my hairs were standing on end, but I wasn't quite sure why. We left and walked out 2 hours back to his house. Even halfway back to his house, he was telling me he wasn't feeling ill anymore, and we talked about it much more when we got back. He seemed confused at the reason why both of us felt so strange in that barn, not to mention his camera and our devices that kept turning off and acting like they were dying. It was truly strange. I told him it could have been one of the spots on the earth, where there's those magnetic shifts, kind of like the Bermuda Triangle, but I have absolutely no idea. I know this used to be a heavy native territory hundreds of years ago, but that's it. Nothing else really interesting happened during the rest of the visit, but that always sticks out to me for some weird reason. I'm new here, but with everything that's going on, it's about time I shared some of my experiences. There's a resort over by Lake Powell, and it's a little nicer, and the cultural influences feel more genuine, as we would often have members from local tribes show us to the mesas and hikes and whatnot. We had this one guy who was our homie, and he took us everywhere and would tell us all the stories and whatever. There were these caves they were not allowed to go in though. They were rather beautiful because he warned us bad creatures lived there. When I would pry into which kind, I asked mountain lions? No, we have guns to protect us from those. And I was left stumped. A few days later, there's an eclipse. For reference, it was the second-ish week of January to maybe early February 2019 I went. I was out by the pool viewing as they had shut the lights off and there were few guests because it was off-season. My friend went back to the room to grab another blanket. I was getting excited as it was getting closer and closer to the peak of the eclipse. I thought I saw him coming through the slats in the fence area around where I was. I saw what looked to be a tallish guy who was slightly hunched over, forward, and had a light by the head area. I thought maybe my friend was on the phone and wrapped in a blanket, which was normal for him. I ran around the corner to tell him to hurry up, and it was gone. A little confused, but hey, the lights were dimmed if not off, and I was so excited that I brushed it off. We were in a car to drive to our next activity the following day with our buddy I mentioned prior. I hadn't told my friend yet, so I told him my story, and our buddy looks back at me. He tells me about the Skinwalkers, how they sell their souls, and I was lucky to have seen one and been okay. First time I have ever heard these, I lived on the East Coast. Long story short though, our trip ends on the last day. We are packing the car and our buddy finds me. He gives me a dream catcher and some tea and some feathers. I emphasize gives me as I didn't have to pay, and tells me to stay safe. Nothing too serious, but something rubbed me the wrong way, and I trust my gut too much. I am submitting this true report for my cousin, who I am very close to and keep in touch with regularly, that lives outside of Gainesville, Florida. She has told me this amazing story several times before, and she is a very trustworthy person. I strongly felt that this amazing encounter of hers should be reported, and she agreed. As she told me, it was a very clear morning. My cousin was driving her and her younger son to town on a narrow stretch of road near Gainesville, Florida, early one morning around 7 a.m. She may have been taking her son to school, but I can't remember. The narrow road she was on had swamps on both sides of it and looked rather messy. As she was driving along, all of a sudden, a hairy upright creature walked right up out of the swamp on one of the sides of the road and continued walking out in front of her car. And then, it just stopped. She immediately stopped the car just a few feet away from this thing, not wanting to hit it, and just stared in shock at what she and her son were seeing. The man-like creature had stopped in the middle of the road and was turned around, looking directly at them. And they got a very good look at the whole body of the creature. The creature walked upright, like a human, with a gait, and looked like a caveman, is the way she put it to me. The creature had hair all over its body, except for around the eyes, nose, and mouth of its face. The most astonishing feature that she noticed was that the creature was wearing some kind of animal skin for protection or something. She was in shock. This creature had to be intelligent to create and wear its own handmade animal skin. The creature showed no aggressive behavior, and after a couple of minutes or so, just casually walked back into the swamp on the other side of the road. The thing looked half human, half ape. The creature was about 8 feet tall as well. When she got home, she told her husband what had happened, and at first he did not believe her. I was a boy of about 12 years of age, camping on my parents' land. We had a house atop a hill that sloped down an acre or two, leading to Bear Creek, which is where our property ended. The land on both of the banks of creek was thickly wooded, and our land was not cleared all the way to the water. 3 of my friends and I had built a fire and unrolled our sleeping bags about 100 or so yards away from the house in the direction of the creek. One of the younger boys was not permitted to stay all night, and as he left to go home, 2 of us were shining our flashlights at him, teasing him about a boogeyman getting him. He was probably about 20 yards or less away from our little campsite, walking through the tall 3 feet grass. In the dim light of the flashlights at the distance, I saw a few yards behind him and walking in the opposite direction, a form that looked like a large biped. My best estimate would make it 6.5 feet or taller. What I saw from halfway between the elbow and shoulder to about halfway between the knee and ankle, so my height estimate is quite rough. It took about 3 strides before it went from one side of the light to the other. The strides were long and smooth, and not at all jerky, and it looked like the knees remained bent, as if it was not standing straight upright, but slouching somewhat, and the arms, they swung low. Under the poor lighting conditions, I could not tell what color it was. It looked gray in the shadowy lighting, and it looked furry or hairy. Had I thought of it, I would have tried to follow the form with my flashlight, but the first thing I did was look at the boy sitting on the ground next to me, who was also holding a flashlight, and he was already looking at me, very wide-eyed. He'd asked, "Did you see that?" And I stood up and called for the departing boy to come back. He returned, and when we had told him what we had seen, neither he nor the other boy there believed us. He went home, and the 2 of us who had seen it, not venturing far from the fire, looked around with our flashlights, but we didn't see anything unusual. Neither of us would admit we were afraid, so we stayed all night, but didn't sleep much. The next day I looked for footprints or disturbed soil or grass, and found nothing. On Thursday, February 17th, 2017, at around 16 to 1700, I believe I spotted a Wendigo in a wooded area behind my residence. I live in an area where Wendigos could and have been spotted, so I don't deny that it was a Wendigo. Anyway, I have found mutilated animals and horrible scenes of death, rot, and decay that would make even well-seasoned veterans throw up. The sights have been just horrifying, and this really supports my theory that something is back in those woods. For example, about 1 month ago, I found my second dead fox. Its head and spinal cord were about 30 feet downhill from the mangroves mess that once was the body. Its body had its front left leg ripped off and large scratches in its chest and sides. Furthermore, it was disemboweled with its intestinal tract in the trees and bushes. There were also signs of a struggle because fur from another animal and some sort of black liquid were on the ground and under its nails. Now, I'm leaving out a lot of details, but those should paint a pretty good picture for you. Now to the juicy part of my experience with this terrible spirit. So let me lay out the land for you. My house is about 100 yards from a small stream that splits the wooded area in half. And on the far side of the stream, from my house, there are very large trees. So I was out there one day, and all of a sudden, I felt cold and uncomfortable, like I was being watched. I also became increasingly paranoid that someone or something was out there with me. So I decided to head in. Plus, the sun was setting and dusk would soon be upon me. So I was starting walking towards my house, which would mean I would have to walk uphill. So I start walking at first, and I was walking out of the woods like I was on someone's yard and they had told me to get off. Not a fast pace, but moving with a purpose, you know? Then I kind of felt like someone was really looking at me. So I turned around and saw a large creature about 80 yards or less. I'm not really sure of how far my house is from that stream, from me standing across the stream. It then proceeded to take a step towards me. And I'm not really too athletic, but I'm not mega weak. I would saw that if I had to run about 20 yards uphill through the woods, it might take me 30 to 40 seconds. Yeah, I ran out of those woods in about 10 seconds flat. It is the most I have ever been scared, and the adrenaline has ever flowed through me. Now that I know what you're wondering, could I have been dehydrated or having hallucinations? Well, I've never hallucinated once in my life, and I was not dehydrated, because about 10 minutes prior to this, I drank an entire bottle of water, and I always make sure I'm hydrated before I go woodland exploring. And there's no way it was a tree, because every time I go out there, I go to where I spotted it. And there isn't a single tree small enough to remotely look like what I saw. Since then, I haven't spotted it, but I do hear it. It is believed by Native Americans that wendigos call out for help just like a human would in order to lure people toward it. I have heard what sounds like a little girl calling for help out in those woods before. It is still terrifying to talk or think about. Could anyone please help me or tell me that I'm not crazy, because I feel like I am. I had a rather odd encounter with some humanoid creature, or even spirit possibly, just a few nights ago, and I haven't been able to come up with a rational answer to just what I had seen. I suppose I will start with the story now. It happened just a few nights ago, when I was biking home from work. I work the closing shifts for my local Walgreens, so I get off work around 10:30. I live only 30 minutes away by bike from my job, but most of the way home is by a heavily forested trail, which doesn't have very many streetlights to begin with, so it's always pitch black when I'm going home. Well, about 5 minutes-ish into the bike ride going home, I hit the beginning of where the streetlights end and the darkness began. And like I always do, I pull out my phone and turn on the flashlight option so I could illuminate my way home. Well, only a few seconds later, after I turned it on, I tilted it up more and froze because I saw this tall, skinny, pale-looking figure for just a brief second before it fell onto all fours, like the wind was gone into the woods. Shortly after, I started to pedal as fast as I could, because I had no clue what it was I had seen, when I heard a low screech, and whatever it was kept pacing with me, hidden in the woods, out of sight. I managed to get out of that area very quickly and didn't see or hear anything after I left that heavily wooded area. But a while later, I caught a scent of what literally smelt like fresh blueberry pancakes or waffles, like as if somebody was standing out in the field with a hot plate of just a pan of blueberry waffles or pancakes, which didn't make sense to me as there are no buildings in the area where that scent was. So I figured perhaps whatever it was I had seen was possibly using scents to try and draw me into the fields or woods. Now, I do know a few areas around the trail are supposedly haunted. There's a dinner theater that's not far from it, and a supposed haunted water tower in the area too, and a couple of other places. But I still, no matter what I think of, I can't rationalize it or even debunk it as something else. Couldn't be a deer because I've talked to people around the area, and no one has seen a deer ever in the area. And besides, it was standing on 2 feet when I saw it, like it was a humanoid. Couldn't have been another wildlife because the only wildlife I have ever spotted are squirrels and birds. But I figured I would share my experience and see if anyone has had something similar or may know a possible rationalized explanation for what I could have seen. When I was a child, about 10 years old, I used to go huckleberry picking with my grandparents. It was an experience that I greatly cherished, and I did that for years. One summer, it was a very hot August day where we went up into northern Idaho and picked a huge batch of huckleberries. My grandparents were picking berries, and I ran off into another spot on the other side of the trail we were on to pick more huckleberries. I grabbed my basket, and I start rotating between stuffing my face with berries and putting them in the basket. I hear this loud crack not far away from me at about my 8 o'clock and turn around in reaction to the loud crack. I froze and dropped my berry basket, covering my mouth so I didn't scream. I can't judge feet well, so I'm gonna say it was probably 50 feet away from me. There, in the trees, was this really scary looking, shaggy dog on 2 legs, holding down this lower thick branch like it was plotting to sneak over this branch and get to me. When I turned to see it, it had an expression on its face like, "Oh shit, I've been caught," kind of look. It had the most intense eyes and stare I've ever seen on a person or an animal. Even at 10 years old, I knew what I was staring at was not an animal. It had too much intelligence in its eyes. It had intent and expression. It was very scary. I thought the way it looked was equally as scary. It was so much bigger than me. It would have dwarfed me had it been next to me. I mean, if this thing wanted to swoop in and grab me and take me away, like it was probably planning to do, it could have done so easily. Sometimes I'll think back about that branch not making the breaking snap sound that it did, and had it not, I think I would have probably been eaten by this thing. I was a skinny, small little scrawny kid, so I'm sure this thing saw me as the perfect grab-and-go kind of meal. It quickly retracted back into the trees after staring me in the eyes for a second, and I took that opportunity to run back to my grandparents, crying, telling them exactly what I saw. My grandparents were great people, and both were versed in the wild enough that they each had their own Bigfoot experiences. When I told them about what I saw, they believed me and comforted me. I'm glad because so many grandparents or parents would have just written a kid off who had seen something like that. We left the area immediately with my grandparents praying over me. But speaking of my grandmother was known in our community for her wonderful huckleberry pies. They were something from another world. They were so good. Secret recipe that had been passed down in our family. Every August, we'd go up into the mountains of Washington, Oregon, or even Idaho and harvest a large batch. I always loved eating them. So good. So, I spend a lot of time out at my friend's property in Plateville, Colorado. So 2 nights, we were just hanging out, and I decided that it was late and I should head home. It was about 12 a.m., so I got in my car and I was driving down his dirt road when my headlights suddenly dim and my motor sounds strained, so I slow down. I drive a pretty modified car, so it has weird issues a lot, so I wasn't worried. So I open my glove box and get my flashlight, and then I look up and see something standing in the road. I quickly reach back into the glove box and grab my gun. So I hit the flashlight and the thing starts to move. It looked like a coyote, but a lot bigger, and instead of paws in the front, it had almost human-like hands. The only issue was this thing was massive. It was the size of a St. Bernard. It walked off the road into the field. I tried to find it with the flashlight, but it was gone. So I get back into my car and take off, and it wasn't acting weird anymore. About 5 minutes later, the same thing happens, and that creature is just sitting in the road again. This time, I didn't stop. I just kept going and didn't hit anything until it was gone. I grew up on a farm, so I'm used to strange noises and weird animals. This thing was different. I've never been this scared in my whole life. I was shaking and short of breath for at least 2 hours afterwards. Hi guys, I've been following this page for a while and I recently had a crazy experience. So here's one of my stories. So a little bit of background. I live in southern Utah, and this area basically belonged to the Native Americans for a very long time. There are old ghost towns nearby and very old graveyards from when the pioneers came in and tried to mine and settle in the area. There is a lot of reservation around also. So basically the perfect cocktail for weird stuff. Anyway, I was out in BLM land one evening by myself because my girlfriend was pulling an all-nighter at the hospital. I was just driving my truck down this dirt road that connects Silver Reef, which is an old mining ghost town, and St. George. I figured I need to get out of the house with the quarantine. No place better to go in the middle of nowhere, so I would not have to be around people. It was late, and there was about an hour of sunlight left, so I pulled over and hiked this beautiful trail that the cattle had made that leads into a slot canyon. I had a flashlight and a headlamp, so I figured I would be fine if I wasn't back by dark. So the hike was going great, and the slot canyon had led me to an area with a lot of Utah juniper trees. It was very pretty, but as I kept hiking, I kept getting this weird feeling like I wasn't the only one out there. Like there was something else behind me. I kept checking behind me, but saw nothing. I figured I was pushing my luck because I already lost the sun, so I started hiking back. I was about 3 miles from my truck when I heard something behind me. It sounded like an animal breathing, but like it had been running. When I flashed my lights, I saw nothing. So I kept walking, and after about 40 yards, I heard it again, so I started to get nervous. I knew that the area I was in was most likely Skinwalker territory, so I said in a calm voice, "I'm sorry if I'm not welcome in this area. I will leave now." As I approached the slot canyon, I saw a shadow run past the entrance, and I stopped, dead in my tracks. I could hear the breathing again from the bushes by the canyon, so I ran straight through the canyon and out the other side. I was about 0.5 miles away from my truck, once on the other side of the canyon. As I kept walking, I kept my guard up because of what I had seen, but I had heard the breathing again, and then even worse, I heard whispers. Nothing I can make out, but I know what I heard. So I ran, and right before I got to my truck, I saw what looked like a deer, but had an odd-shaped head, like more round than normal, and I could see its eyes, and they didn't look like a deer eyes. As I had my headlamp on it, I flashed my flashlight on it and ran before my light reached it. It didn't hesitate or run straight for my truck and jump in. I drove straight home and slept with the light on that night. Thank you for reading my experience. I would love to hear what you guys think. This isn't my only experience, but it is certainly my most scary. My fiancé had an accident at work last summer where he received burns on his hand, and I had to take him into the burn center in Gainesville at Shands. I was driving home with him in the car, and he was asleep from the painkillers he was on due to his burns. I had my high beams on and was going roughly 45 miles an hour down SR 16 eastbound near Stark Camp Blanding. A creature ran across the road on all fours or heavily crouched over. It did not have a tail, and in the high beams it looked bluish gray. Its rear end was pushed up high from the ground, about 4 feet or so, but when it got to the other side of the road, it just stood up and ran on 2 legs. I noticed its face was very flat, with no snout or jawline, but with hair all around it. It happened very fast, but I'm sure it wasn't a bear, because I could not see a visible snout, and I'm sure it was not a panther, because there was not a tail. Once it stood up, it looked to be about 6 feet tall. Once it crossed the road, it kept on running into the woods and never slowed down. While it was running on the asphalt, it looked like a lemur, running on all fours. Once it hit the grass, it stood up and continued running bipedally without skipping a beat and made maybe 3 steps until it was in the woods. I turned to my fiance and asked, "Did you see that?" But he was unconscious. I didn't mention it earlier because I never really thought twice about it, but my fiance and I were watching TV and it was a Bigfoot documentary. So I asked him if he remembered the event and he said no, but then told me to go ahead and report it anyway. I was driving down the state road at 9 p.m. on September 17th, 2011. This road is good for heavy traffic and none at all. At the time, I was the only car on the road going both directions. I was headed south towards State Road 528. The 407 runs adjacent to the Canaveral Marsh, lands full of deer, hogs, birds, and plenty of other native wildlife. At 9:10 or so, I saw what appeared to be a skunk ape cross the road right in front of me. This road fits one car in each direction. The skunk ape appeared to be running because it crossed the road in 2 steps very easily. After the second step, it jumped down into the side embankment and into the bushes next to the road. I did get a good look at it since I was driving at a pace to avoid hitting deer that crossed the road very frequently. The animal had long hair all over its body, especially on the arms and shoulders. This is the reason I know it was in a sprint. The hair was flowing like it would if it was blowing in the wind. The color of the hair seemed to be dark, reflecting against my headlights and the moonlight. I really couldn't tell the color though. It had a cone-shaped head, very long arms, and when it jumped down into the embankment, the arms went up in the air as to help keep its balance or not hit anything. I saw the side profile of the face. The face was dark, since again it was at nighttime, and it seemed ape-like. The feet were huge. As it took steps, I noticed how large they were. The all-over body seemed very thick. The animal was very muscular. From the side view I had, you can see just how thick of a body it was. I didn't stop to investigate due to the fact that it was nighttime, and I did not want to have a face-to-face with whatever I saw alone on a dark road. Thinking about the situation as it constantly replayed in my mind, I think it might have been in pursuit of a deer. I constantly see deer on the road at night and into the early morning. This was my first time seeing a skunk ape, but I have heard they were sighted sometimes in the area further south on State Road 520. I feel with the rise in deer population, it might have moved into the area. Growing up in the mountains of northern Georgia, camping and hiking were things that me and my brother did so often it was second nature. So anytime Ryan and I had a break from school, we would head straight for the woods. We packed our gear, let our parents know where we were, and that was that. No questions asked. We decided to camp about midways through Jack's River Trail, and it's a trail we knew fairly well, as we had used to use it a few times before to practice on for long hikes. We arrived at the trailhead around lunchtime, parked the car, got our gear out, and headed into the woods. We passed a few hikers as we moved along and asked them how the trail looked, and the answer was always the same: wet. Jack's River Trail probably crossed the river 50 times as it went along its 17-mile-plus journey, and with the colder temperatures of late fall setting in, it was harder for the trail to stay dry. We moved deeper into the trail and started to look for a place to make camp. This is where Ryan and I made our first mistake. You see, Ryan and I have this rule: we don't camp near people, if at all possible. Call us paranoid, but the last thing we want is for someone to drag us out of our tents and into the woods to never be seen again. So we always camped a pretty decent spot ways off the trail and in the area that wasn't popular with overnight camping. Roughly 2.5 hours or so, we found what we thought was the perfect place to set up for the 2 nights that we would be out. We came up to the Horseshoe Bend and ventured about a half-mile off the trail into a clearing and set up there. We built a teepee fire lay for that night and pitched our tents on either side. After setting up and unloading, we decided to walk back to the trail and go exploring around some of the many swimming holes Jack's River had to offer. This was during Thanksgiving break, and I remember being surprised at how few people were on the trail. Maybe it was the weather, or the fact that this was early in the week, but there didn't seem to be anyone hiking, much less staying the night. Around 5 o'clock, Ryan and I headed back to camp to start our fire, make dinner, and settle in for the night. As soon as the sun began to set, the cold rushed in. We added more wood to the fire, sat close, and just enjoyed conversation. Ryan was 2 years behind me in school. I was a senior, and he was a sophomore, but growing up, we had always been close. We always hung out in the same groups, played the same sports, and even the same hobbies, etc. Around 9, we were settled comfortably around the fire. I had just texted our mom to let her know we were safe and getting ready for bed, and I remember we were talking about dreading going to our grandparents' house for Thanksgiving and having some awkward conversations we had each year with family we only saw on the holidays, when things start to get strange. We were no stranger to the sounds of woods, and these woods were full of animals, from deer to black bears and even the random wild boar. If you are in the woods enough, you learn to distinguish certain sounds, and what we were hearing, I can only chalk up to as odd. What Ryan and I heard was what sounded like somebody sneaking around slowly, just out of eyesight. With an animal walking on 4 legs, you hear a tighter group of steps, but what we were hearing sounded very distinct to what a bipedal human sounds like when walking slowly or trying to move without making too much sound. I remember we both pulled out our flashlights and shone it in the direction we felt the sounds were coming from. But that is what was so weird. Whenever we would fix our lights on a spot we thought the sound were coming from, the location of the sound would suddenly change. It was as if there were multiple people walking around us. That's when the whistling started. At first, I thought it was the wind, and I remember thinking maybe the wind is just throwing leaves around, and what we are hearing is nothing but the wilderness around us. Ryan looked at me and asked if I was hearing that. I didn't answer and was trying to focus hard on each individual sound. 2 consecutive notes with roughly a 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes, over and over again. Ryan kept asking if I had heard that, and I put my finger to my lips, trying to keep him from talking. The fear I felt was incredible. My jaw was tight, my fist clenched, knowing I wasn't ready for whatever was out there, if anything at all. The whistling continued for what felt like forever, but thinking it through was maybe 5 minutes when Ryan finally yelled out into the darkness, "Hey!" Quiet. The whistling stopped. The crunching of woods stopped. Nothing. I was pissed. I looked at Ryan with a "what the hell" look, and he shrugged his shoulders. "I had to do something," he said. I just shook my head. We sat there in silence for a few moments, and when the woods erupted with noise. Something or someone was running in a circle around our campsite. The whistling came back. 2 consecutive notes with the same 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. How could someone whistle this loudly without cracking while also running? I was done. I stood up, shining my flashlight in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was screwing with us. Nothing. It felt close enough to touch, but we never saw a thing. That's when the movement stopped, but the whistling was still constant. It was so loud, inhumanly loud. I looked at Ryan and told him to call the police now. This is the part I will never forget, the part I never like to talk about. While Ryan was on the phone with the dispatcher and telling them our location and what was going on, I stepped around the fire towards my tent. Inside my bag, I had a 6-inch fixed blade that I always carried and thought I would feel a bit more comfortable with it in my hand, more than just my flashlight. As I went to unzip my tent, trying to keep my eyes toward the woods. I heard some movement directly in front of me. I swept my light up directly in front of me, and for maybe 2 seconds, I saw it. Whatever this person or thing was, it was about 5 feet up in a tree. Everything about it was long. Its arms, legs, neck, fingers, everything. And it was fast. As soon as the light hit it, it launched backwards off of the tree. I heard it land, but it either jumped at an impossible distance or landed in a thicket because I heard it, but never saw. I don't think I have ever yelled so loud. I ran back to where Ryan was and sat down. He kept asking me what I saw, but I couldn't answer. I just kept thinking about what I saw. And maybe 10 minutes later, we saw a couple of flashlight beams coming through the woods, and about 3 guys came into view asking if everything was okay. I settled a bit and started asking them if they had seen or heard anything. All they said was they heard a lot of movement and then heard my scream, and that's when they headed in our direction. I tried to explain what had happened without sounding crazy, but it didn't seem to work. One of the guys walked around a bit and came back and said he didn't see anything. Ryan told them that we called the police, and roughly 30 minutes later, a park ranger finally showed up. Ryan and I tried explaining everything to him, but he just chalked it up to either a curious animal or maybe some campers trying to mess with us. Either way, Ryan and I decided we weren't staying there that night. We packed up our stuff and walked out of the woods with the ranger. He took our statement and we got in our car and drove home. Ryan and I don't talk about what happened that night, but neither of us have been back to Jack's River Trail and will probably never go back. When I was 12, around 2005, I saw something that I still cannot explain. It was night, and I was lying on my bed, enjoying the wonders of three-way calling, when something outside caught my eye. My bed had a window about 2 feet away from it, and I could see the tree outside my house very clearly from the head of my bed. As I ignored my friends, I looked out of my window and watched in shock as a tall, metallic, light blue creature leapt from the base of the tree onto one of the middle branches. Now, there's no way in hell that a branch about 3 inches in diameter could hold a creature of this size. It was over 6 feet tall, smooth skin, muscular build, and strangely shaped facial features. As I lied there, in a mixture of shock and awe, the creature just crouched on the branch, watching me curiously. I didn't feel any fear, just a bit shocked at what I was seeing. After about 15 to 20 minutes of watching this thing sit there, it lifted its head and let out a call that sounded like if a duck was quacking underwater, and jumped down from its perch. I watched it as it casually crawled back into the tree line and disappeared. I've never seen it again, but it's something that has always stuck with me. I'm hoping someone may have a similar experience, or some insight as to what I witnessed that night. Its head was proportionate to its body, but it appeared to have a short snout. Also, that leap would have been about 15 feet high, and it did it with ease. I lived in the same house until 2015, and I would very frequently walk about a quarter of a mile to my friend's house at night. The path was a dirt path, and on the right side, directly next to the trail, was a heavily wooded area. To the left was an open field that was against a canyon full of springs and trees. Some nights, I could feel that creature nearby, and instead of frightening me, it would put me at ease. Leadville, Colorado, October 29th, 1880. For some time, past the miners in the vicinity of Grizzly Peak, about 40 miles southeast of this city, have reported the presence of a strange animal different from anything known in the mountains. On a number of different occasions, a creature resembling a man, save for the extraordinary length of the arms and the long shaggy hair that covered this body, has been seen at a distance among the rocks. At first, its existence was supposed to be a myth, and the miners who brought in the story were hooted at and generally disbelieved. Finally, however, there were so many witnesses that it became undeniable that it was fact, that a wild animal totally different from anything known to science or natural history existed somewhere amidst the rocky layers of the adjoining mountains. Hello, my name is Richard, and I'm a cryptid researcher. I've been doing this for the past 12 years now, and I'm trying to branch out in the community and share more of my experiences and stories from many eyewitnesses I've interviewed and talked to. I'm always out digging and trying to gather and collect more information. I have a ton of Dogman stories to share with you from eyewitnesses that I've spoken to over the years. I haven't really shared much of these because I truly felt that I just hadn't found the right YouTuber or person to release them through quite yet. I think you'll do better with some of these stories than others will. One of the more recent stories I wanted to share with you was when I interviewed this older gentleman who had lived and resided in West Virginia all of his life. He was a native, but I can't remember the tribe that he belonged to. He told me a story of how one of these dog beasts of the swamp came and took his brother when they were both very young. This older gentleman was in his 70s, and his brother was only 3 years younger than him. He was 12 at the time, and his younger brother was 9. He was out playing in the woods when the beast, as this older man describes, came out of the woods and grabbed onto his brother and carried him away deeper into the forest. This man immediately told his family, and the family told the elders about the boy being grabbed. They sent some of their own men of the tribe to go into the deep part of the woods to track down his brother, but they never found any trace of him. They gave up hope after a few days, knowing that he was probably gone for good. He never did come back, and that's something that has changed him forever, even as a younger boy. From my own research, I haven't came across anything along the lines of anyone being captured or kidnapped or taken by these things. But who's to say that can't be a thing? This older man showed me some of the relics and totems their tribe used to ward these beings and other foul spirits away. He recited me some prayers that he grew up praying with to keep his tribe and family safe. He did not have much to say about other matters, like what this beast looked like exactly when it happened. I could tell it was still hard for him to talk about, so I didn't press the issue too much. The one takeaway I got from this gentleman was that his tribe had numerous run-ins with these beasts, stealing supplies and children from their villages. His brother was not the first or only young child to be taken by these same creatures. I've noticed other similar patterns in behavior by the Sasquatch in Northern California. The local tribes of the land refer to a Sasquatch as mountain devils, and they would come into these villages during the night and kidnap children and women. So to hear almost the same thing is happening on the opposite end of the coast by a completely different cryptid is simply fascinating. It tells us these creatures truly do act in a similar way, and maybe they are tied together in one way or another. As you'll know, Bigfoot and Dogman don't like each other for some reason. There always seems to be situations where Bigfoot will come into an area that Dogman aren't, and as soon as Dogmen arrive in the area, the Bigfoot will be gone. There are a few tales passed down if you get a chance to talk to the right tribesmen about these beings fighting. There was a scarce amount of written record of this happening for certain villages. I believe these beings fought over territory. That's my conclusion at least. The fellow in which I've been speaking about told me it's because they were fighting over food supply between children, deer, and all other wildlife out in the swamp and surrounding lands. It all provided ample food and cover for these cryptids. This being, or these beings, were known about long before his brother was ever taken, and even he knew about it, but had never actually seen one in the flesh. He knew many people in his tribe, and still do, that have had multiple run-ins with these things. Mostly in the swamp, that's where they like to hunt and live, he had told me. Even his grandfather and the village elders when he was a boy had forewarned about the beasts and shared their own tales of encountering both beasts fighting or just running into one another. It was when they would go out to hunt to seek food. Sometimes the Dogman would learn the behaviors of the villagers when they had soldiers patrolling to know when to sneak in and not be seen. These are very intelligent beings, and even he agreed with me on that. They are not to be underestimated. That's why when you're outside of the village getting supplies, wood, water, or anything and you're by yourself, you need to be aware of where you are and where you were going. There were just certain spots you wouldn't go to or visit because you could feel their presence around you, and you knew you didn't have long, or else you would be taken too. There were many of these areas, but mostly a mile or more out into the swamp. They had lost several of their own village people from those who had wandered too far out in the name of exploration or supplies and never returned. These things thrive in the swamps from what I've gathered, which to me is surprising because there are so many Dogman encounters that happen in places that aren't necessarily swampy or are far more desert-like. I guess Dogman can really be found anywhere, from dense, lush forests to suburban areas, as we've all seen and heard encounters there, even swamps. This email could go on forever, so I'll stop and just share this one story with you for now. I'll be sending you many more for you and your audience to enjoy. Thanks. This happened when I was about 9 or 10, which is why I'm not exactly sure on the specifics of the encounter. However, I think I've figured out pretty much well how it went from thinking it over so many years now. I am absolutely certain of the few brief seconds I encountered the creature. When I was younger, I lived in Texas, which is what makes me think it was a skinwalker and not something else since it's down south. And at the back of my house was a 7-foot-tall cattle fence, which I would often look through to watch the cows on the other side. There was a small thicket, 200 to 300 feet away from the fence. I went out one day to watch the cows, which were pretty far away from the fence. While I was standing there, I guess I didn't notice it approach me, even though it was probably not more than a foot away. But I turned my head to the right and saw a big buck staring me down. I don't know how it walked up to the fence without being noticed by me or noticing me, since deer in general are very skittish. This is one of the reasons I believe it wasn't a normal deer. The next reason is that while our eyes were locked, its eyes didn't look natural. They didn't look malevolent, but they weren't normal animal eyes. They seemed to possess an intelligent quality, as if staring into my soul. The moment that we locked eyes couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, with one motion, the buck jumped over the fence so fast that I didn't even see it jump. I was grasping the fence before the encounter, and the buck's back hooves must have clipped it because I heard a metallic clang and felt the fence vibrate in my hands. Deer can clear fences as high as 8 feet, so I guess the height isn't that odd. What is odd to me is that the deer and I were side by side, and I was holding onto the fence, so I'm not sure how the deer could have cleared it without momentum. Then again, I don't have experience with deer, so it could be something they're able to do. I don't know. Anyway, it bounded into the thicket, and I saw a doe, what I think was a doe, jointed in there. But I waited for them to come out and they didn't, which is also very odd to me. The thicket wasn't big either. Another odd thing I just realized is while we were out there during the day, because as far as I know, deer are mainly nocturnal, and this was midday. After this happened, I ran inside and told my mom and dad, and that's basically where it ended. I've been wondering if anyone has had similar encounters to mine for years, because while parts of the encounter are kind of normal for deer, other parts are wildly irregular or out there for deer behavior. If anyone has similar stories, I would love to hear them, and if anyone can tell me if what I encountered was a skinwalker or something else, please let me know. Could this have been a skinwalker, adorned and dressed as a deer? I have believed in skinwalkers for most of my life, and I'm confident that I've seen a skinwalker 2 times. I grew up spending a lot of time in southwest Colorado by the Four Corners where there are Navajo and Indian reservations. In the small town of Cortez, which is a non-reservation, there is a story known by the locals about this place called Skinwalker Lane. It's this old dirt road just outside the reservation that leads to an abandoned cabin. The cabin is decades old and is said to have been built unrightfully on Indian burial grounds by white men. As the story goes, a white family lived there and disappeared mysteriously. As a couple of dumb teenagers, me and a few of my cousins didn't believe in, well, what we thought was a hoax, Skinwalker Lane, and wanted to go check it out. We all piled into our old Jeep SUV and drove all the way out to Skinwalker Lane at about 11 p.m. at night when it was pitch black. The sky was lit up from the moon, and you can make out the peaks of Sleeping Mountain in the distance, and the edges of the willows which line either side of Skinwalker Lane. As we slowly eased down the road, the car got quiet, and we all had a weird feeling. Deer, in groups of 2 or 3, kept poking their heads out of the willows and just stared at us without caution. I thought this was weird because deer are usually jumpy creatures. After about 1.5 miles of this road, we finally get to the clearing, which opened up to a big field. At the other end of the field, you could see the old cabin. At this point, we were creeped out and reluctantly continued across the lightly used road until we were about 150 feet from the cabin. The cabin was very dark, the wood was rotted, and there were weird carvings all over it that looked like some sort of tribal symbols. We decided to just sit and look at it for a while to see if anything had happened, since we were all too scared to walk up to it. Out of nowhere, this shrill, skin-peeling howl came out of nowhere. It was a long howl, but by the time it had ended, it changed and sounded more like a man screaming. From the left side, something on 2 feet ran heavy-footed behind the cabin, but on the other side came out an enormous coyote, which looked more similar to a wolf in size. The coyote just stood and stared us down, eyes glowing a deep blood red. We were so freaked out and drove out immediately. I will always believe in skinwalkers after that night. I'm a fishing guide in Florida for well over 25 years and spend approximately 200 days on the water a year. On a charter last month, I had a Delta pilot and a lawyer on my boat. As we pulled into a remote area on the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge, I noticed something bent over and walking up a sandbank approximately 100 yards from us. It was just after a good daylight. I thought bear? Hog? As it walked closer, one of my clients noticed it and said, "What is that?" I was speechless. It walked to and within 40 yards, stood up and faced us for about 15 seconds. It took 3 steps, turned sideways, and looked at us over its shoulder for another 10, and then walked into the mangroves. The pilot said that that was a Sasquatch, and it was apparently 7 feet tall, long reddish-brown fur, and was built like a side-by-side fridge, very square. Its face looked more caveman than ape. The wind was in our face, and we were silent in my flat skiff. I think that is why he didn't know we were there, as he was hunting the sand beach for food. We were heading home from work, approximately 11 p.m. There was rain and we came up on what we thought was a person along the side of the road, but as we got closer, what we saw was something that was around 7 feet tall to 7.5 feet tall. Long, dirty, shaggy yellow-looking hair. Could not see the face well because of all the hair. It had a tarp or piece of plastic over it. It was getting ready to cross the highway from a wooded area, and as we passed it, my friend and I started describing what we both had seen, and had chills ran through my body. We were going to turn around and see if we could get the figure out and what it was, but we were too scared to. I have never seen anything like that in my life. It was not a man. It was entirely too tall. For several months after seeing it, I wouldn't drive the U.S.A at night. I instead traveled I-95. I was flipping through the channels last week, watching some late-night TV, when I saw a program called Finding Bigfoot. It brought me back to the day my mind about the giant changed for me. I only told my mom what I saw. It really changed my life about the unknown. I was running my airboat on the upper St. Johns River, doing what I like to do best, frog jigging on a Friday night. It wasn't the first time I was out on the river at night. I used to run the north and south parts of the river all the time. I still do, just at night, and I make sure I have a running buddy with me. Anyway, I was coming back up on the Oaks. The Oaks are located right next to Duda's property, just a wee south of Lake Winder. I figured I would pull up in the Oakhead and drink a few cups of joe before I started to gig. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something bolt into the cabbage palms. I figured it to be a hog. I really did not know what it was, and the last thing on my mind was what it could have been. Anyway, I ran up on dry ground, about 15 yards, spun my boat around so it was pointed toward the river, and shut it down. I just poured a cup of joe when I had heard something about 10 yards behind me. It sounded like it was wrestling with a cabbage palm, or maybe rolling around in a bunch of palms. Then out of nowhere, I heard a thump right next to my boat. I looked but did not see anything, and then again I heard it behind my boat. Then something hit my rudders. I turned on my headlamp and saw mud on my rudders, and I then saw a bunch of mud fly over me and hit my bow. I shined my light in the direction of where it was coming from, and I saw his face. I lost all feeling in my body, and I just about passed out, and I lost it. I don't know what to do. I was in total shock. I just about peed my pants, I was so scared. I never in my natural-born life moved so fast to crank my boat and get the hell out of there. I almost sank my boat when I hit the river. I just went north knowing I would be in the lake. I was scared to drive home, so I parked in the middle of the Lake Winder and took a few sips of drink to calm my nerves and to try to talk myself out of what I saw. I stayed there until first light. When I got home, I went and seen my mom and had to tell her what I saw. I told her the story because it scared me so. I am a man and I am tough, but that scared the living hell out of me. I figured I should share my story, just like others are on that show. A little backstory. I was 13 at the time, and I come from a family of native descent, and we believe in many things similar to the Wendigo and Skinwalker, the whistling woman like the La Llorona, and alike. We also have what seems some would call spiritual gifts that allow us to see spiritual energy, like negative energy and evil spirits. These gifts are what allow us to see these creatures and spirits alike, as well as being able to have connection to God and His angels. We had been wanting to go to another camping trip for ages, and after some debate, due to some of my nephews catching a bad cold, it was finally arranged. After arriving at the site, it was normal than any other trip for the most part, except there were matte signs of bad luck, a terrible omen, dead birds on the drive, my 7-year-old brother almost falling outside of our moving car due to a lock malfunction, and during the last few days of the 2-week vacation, strange things started happening. Food, drawers, cabinets, doors would all be open, and random chairs and Tupperware would go missing. But we chalked it up to some rowdy teenagers at the other campsite, though we all knew it wasn't just some kids. This was some far more treachery, but no one wanted to admit that it wasn't as simple as wandering animals or some thieving people. Until some days later, when even stranger things started to occur, like hearing footsteps behind us stopping one step after we did, the feeling of being watched, and a strong rancid odor when being completely alone. Imagine feces mixed with hot, rotted meat and then thrown into a fire. Although these occurrences were a disturbance, it did not deter us from staying for the final 2 days, as we had been planning it for months. But one experience years ago, on the day right before our departure, still haunts me to this very day. I had been strolling through the forest while looking for firewood when I heard rustling in the bushes behind me. As this happened, it seemed that all life ceased around me because I could only hear my heartbeat and the lone, heavy footsteps approaching me. Then I heard my name called from what seemed to be every direction, yet echoed from in front of me while also coming from behind. The voice calling me was a harsh, raspy, animalistic in tone, imitations of my sister, who had just recently left the trip due to stress only a few hours ago. This had sent horrendous chills down my spine, so I ran the fastest that I've ever had back down towards the campsite, while I heard the twigs and leaves crunching behind me. I had finally reached the campsite when the footsteps suddenly stopped. I was relieved and slumped over to the cabin stairs when I slipped on a rock, slipping out of the makeshift fire. It had caused my head to go straight into it. The blazing force of nature had almost burned my face when I just stopped mid-fall. I hadn't gained my balance, but it was as if just somebody was hanging on to me and pulled me back. I'm not sure what it was, but my family suggests that it was my guardian angel, saving me from an early death. But after that experience, I have never been to the same campsite ever again, and didn't go camping for a few years after that. Still, what really scares me the most from back then was when we had been leaving the site. I looked back from the car window and saw a figure standing at the tree line staring at me. It was lanky and looked starved to the point of having its skin wrapping tightly against its bones. But when I looked onto the pathway, the footprints were completely gone. And as I blinked, we rounded the corner and it seemingly vanished into thin air. This has left me questioning, what is those woods and was it a reality? But when my sister asked me why I was so shaken, I told her what I experienced and her face went pale. A scary, gaunt figure had been watching us across the riverbank, and then it had noticed her and ran away on all fours at a fictional speed, she shakily said, staying quite frightened after. I can't exactly say I've always been a believer in skinwalkers. My dad used to talk about them and how he believed in them, but I always thought it was silly. Tonight, that changed. I snuck out of my house to go out on a walk. It was about 2 a.m., and my parents didn't exactly know. It was mildly peaceful. I'm not very much afraid of the dark, so I don't get anxious from these kinds of walks. It's windy tonight, so there were a lot of loud noises. I got far from my house, where there is a large stretch of woods. It's an area where we don't usually see deer because it's close to a highway. It's southern Maryland, so it's usually foxes and birds at best. I inspected the woods and had the most terrifying and blood-curdling fear when I saw what I can only really describe as a skinny, disfigured silhouette with antlers. But not like a big deer. They were small. It stood tall and is unlike anything I've seen. I cannot even comprehend what I've seen. I don't know if it could have been real, and within 10 seconds of seeing, I took off running, and I couldn't think of anything else to do. I ran fast, not looking back, I was so terrified. I ran through my neighbor's yard to get home faster. I don't know how to feel about it. I don't know if I'm overreacting and I just saw a deer or something, but I don't know if I can sleep. I'm constantly looking outside and terrified. Okay, so my dad bought a cabin in the woods about 3 years ago, and I've gone every other weekend, but I don't know if I should go. Me and my friends decided to go this weekend, so we all packed up and began a 3-hour drive. We got there late, so we just went to the front yard and started a fire. Only thing we had brought in the house at this point were sleeping essentials, so one of my friends decides to take a piss in the woods. He was gone for maybe 40 minutes. When he got back, he looked pale. I asked him what was wrong, and he looked at me and said nothing after about 2 hours. We then went inside, and we all went to our separate rooms. And after about another 2 or 3 more hours of sleeping, at about 4 a.m., rolled around, I was woken up by my friend's screams when I went into his room. He was gone. I ran downstairs to the car where my other friend was sitting, waiting desperately for me. I jumped in and I asked him what had happened. He started to drive at about 90. I saw a black figure in the tree line running towards the car. It was keeping up with us, and I was astonished, but after a while it stopped and turned towards the cabin. We didn't see it, and so we stopped driving until we get to the nearest town when we get back to my place. My friend told me what he had seen. He told me that he had heard the screams and ran into the room, but when he got there, he just saw a black figure in a window, and it looked like a wolf, but stood like a man, and it had our other friend in its mouth. He said that the creature ran into the forest with our friend, and he then ran to the car and saw me running out. I don't know if I could ever go back to that cabin again. It was about 11 p.m., and I had stopped in the middle of the road to go to the bathroom. Nova Road is 30 miles long in cattle country. After 20 seconds of being out in my car, my sister said somebody was coming. After she said that, I heard branches breaking to the side of the road where the woods are. I glanced to where the sound was coming from and saw a tall, dark animal running toward my car. The animal had to be 7 to 8 feet tall. After I saw the thing running from the woods on the side of the road, I ran back into my car. I was scared. When I first saw it, the thing was running from the woods towards me and my car, and I'm like, well, we're out of here. It ran like a man, upright. It was 11 p.m., so naturally the color was dark in appearance, but from my taillights, I'd still say it was dark in color, and it moved fairly quickly, which is why I jumped back into my car so quick. As I sped away, I tapped my brake lights and saw the thing standing there in the road looking at us as we drove away from it. It was a really creepy feeling. I still remember it clearly to this day. It was just so eerie. I didn't notice any sound just when I had heard the first branch break, and then the footsteps increased a lot. And after I heard this, then I turned around and looked towards the side of the road. It could have made a noise, but I went from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, so I didn't notice any other sounds. My sister actually heard the noise of the thing first, and she said something is coming, so I'm like, yeah, right. But then I heard it, and then we saw it. She was so afraid that she couldn't stop laughing. I know, strange, right? But she was actually laughing because I jumped so quickly back into the car. She was still in the car, and she said she didn't know what it was, and neither did I at the time. Back in 1985 to 86, my family had relocated to Coral Springs from Miami before the Sawgrass Expressway was built. We lived so close to the glades, my friend and I used to ride our skateboards to the levee and watch the Everglades burn. At the time, some firebug had set quite a blaze. On some mornings, we'd wake to cars and yards covered in ash. Needless to say, a lot of wildlife began to migrate closer to our neighborhood. For example, deer, alligators, whatever. One night we pitched a tent in my friend's backyard, approximately 50 yards from a canal that separated us from an apartment complex, and across from that was the beginning of the Everglades. The fires had been raging for weeks, and people in the area were reporting missing pets, some of which were inside 6-foot privacy fences. We used to run between the houses to cut through to go home. This night in particular, before we called it quits, we played a bit of hide and seek. I remember hiding under a window box behind a bush and got spotted by an unmarked police car. We really thought we were in trouble, but the police were looking for a person that had been peeping in windows. We assured the cops we weren't the perps and went on about our business and went to the tent. 3 kids in a tent don't sleep well, so we're having fun cracking jokes and noticed a sound coming from across the canal, approximately 100 yards away. Something was slamming the dumpster lids in the complex across the way and making low, deep sounds, grunts. These were tall dumpsters. You'd have to get a boost to lift the lid. We got real quiet, trying to listen to figure out what it could be. At first, we figured a cow got loose and possibly was bumping into the dumpster. but it became evident that wasn't so. One of the kids I was with turned on a flashlight and started making shadow puppets with his E.T. stuffed animal. Then, the thing from across the canal took notice of us for the first time. The grunts were still audible, but with what I would say was a hint of curiosity. We got quiet and real concerned, putting two and two together. Could this be what the police were looking for? The steps grew closer and closer. I remember we tried to figure it out as if it was a quadruped or a biped. When the steps had finally stopped, the breathing grew louder, and then splash! Whatever it was, 50 yards from us, coming right in our direction. We sprinted for the house, waking up my friend's family. They were woken by 3 screaming kids at 2 a.m, exclaiming something is out there. His dad grabbed his shotgun, turned on the floodlights, and he went out to look around and found the tent was demolished and covered in water. I swear I could feel this thing right around the corner in the shadows, looking right at us. We did not let his father investigate further until morning and couldn't believe the tent had been moved from its position. I have no doubt we stayed in that tent. This story would be much different, if at all. I am 35 now and have never forgotten that night. My partner lives on the edge of a large, unspoiled state park, with miles of forest all around. When I'm there working on our project, I have to go outside to smoke, and I would usually just sit on a log and scan the wilderness for deer or other critters to pass the time. It's very quiet, no traffic sounds, just the raw wildlife. One afternoon, as I sat looking into the woods, I heard what sounded like a baby or a very small child crying. By the sound of it, at least, I would guess that. And I would guess that it was no more than 100 yards into the forest, but the trees and brush obstructed the view. I am no stranger to the woods, and I was certain that sound was probably a fawn looking for its mother, and not a human. So, I went back in to work. Soon after that, I had to drive into town for parts, which took about 2 hours before I got back. The sun was just going down as I took up my usual smoking spot. The crying continued with a sense of urgency coming from the same approximate area in the woods. I was still convinced it was a baby deer and supposed its mother was dead somewhere. I was at a critical part of the project and really couldn't stop to go rescue a baby fawn. About an hour later, I was at a stopping point and went out for a smoke. The crying was still there, and by now, it sounded like it was losing strength. It was now or never. I went in and got a wall-charged spotlight with the green light indicating a full battery and a short piece of rope. By now, it was jet dark out with heavy cloud cover as I dutifully plunged into the brush at the edge of a ravine that was steep enough to have a slide down on my butt, walked through the shallow creek and scaled the other side using boots and branches to climb up. I expected to come back through this with a baby deer in my arms and would just have to deal with that when I came to it. Once I got back on level ground on the opposite bank, the crying sounded closer, but still not visible in the search beam. This area was new growth, with saplings and thorn brush extending up a slight incline with the occasional oak and walnut trees. I stopped to rest and looked around to get my bearings, but couldn't see any lights from the house. Nothing but woods, and a crying baby somewhere in the middle distance. I plodded up the incline for approximately 100 yards in the direction of the sound, but still couldn't visualize the animal. It still sounded like the crying was about 100 yards away. I guessed it was walking away from me, so I called out in a soft, unthreatening manner. The crying paused for a second, and then started again. I thought maybe it stopped walking now, and I kept going, "It's all right, buddy. I won't hurt you." I pushed my way through the tangles and thorns to another open area where I stopped to scan with the light. Nothing but the sound of crying just out of sight. Now that I was closer to the source, the sound was eerily like a human, which just made the circumstance all the more frustrating. If it was a child, it apparently didn't speak English because no calls were answered. By now, I thought it was a child lost in the woods and was too terrified to speak to me. Between me and the sound of a formidable fortress of blackberry bushes with a spiderweb of grapevines covering the outer surface. This is tough to get through, even with a chainsaw. So I knelt down to a low crawl into the base. That's when the light went out. No fade out, no warning, just off. The battery indicator was also off. This device was completely dead. The darkness was absolute as I stood back up to get my bearings. The crying had stopped, and there was no sound, no crickets, peepers, of anything. I looked around without moving my feet, so I could approximate the direction I had come. Not a single light of civilization could be seen anywhere. And now the flashlight had become a useless piece of responsibility that occupied one of my only two tools, my hands. I had left my lighter and cigarettes on the log since I didn't know it was going to take this long. I had the rope around my neck and shoulder, and that was the extent of my resources. The crying sound was replaced by a whimpering from apparently the same original location, about 30 feet through the bramble fortress. As I stood there in absolute darkness, I did the math. If it was a human, I obligated by creed and honor to attempt to reach this child under these conditions, even at my own peril. So I knelt back down. I had to go. I had to. I took off the rope so I could snake through the thorns with a little snaggage as possible. I took in a deep breath and ready to go in, and just then, I hear a giggle coming from right beside my right foot. In my mind, I could see it from about 4 inches away and from about 12 inches high. Under any other circumstances, I would have immediately concluded a practical joke, and even gave that the benefit of a doubt for a moment. Hard as it was, I kept my feet planted so I wouldn't lose the only thing I had, a relative direction to go back to the world. There was no more crying, and I had the feeling the giggle came from the same organism now somewhere behind me. I heard leaves ruffle and small twigs cracking here and there. It giggled again with an unmistakable lilt of threat, about 5 feet to my left. Then I heard a second giggle coming from up above, about 20 feet away, not moving. A split second later, it had soundlessly joined the first on the ground to my left and giggled from roughly the same 12-inch stature. They were able to circle me and move off very fast, judging by the sound of the leaves and stems. At this point, I had concluded that there was no child in danger, and I needed to get the hell out of there. I did an about face and started off thinking even if I'm off by several degrees, I'll still eventually see light from the house. When you make the decision to flee, it starts a cascade effect of fear and harder flight. The two entities were staying about 2 feet behind me as I began picking up speed, slamming face first into oaks and plowing through raspberries without regard to ripping and tearing of flesh and clothes. Still, my pursuers outright laughed as I barreled through heavy growth. Spiderwebs and blood covered my face at one point. The laughing came from just inches from my right ear. I felt like a stampeding steer, blindly bulldozing anything in its way. I finally reached the edge of the ravine and now could see the house light and my partner on the other shore. I half slid and jumped down the 20-foot wall into the creek with a faceplant. While struggling to get back up, I could hear the two giggling, sneering entities from the edge of the ravine. My partner called out, "Are you all right?" And I replied, "Can you see them? There's 2 of them right near the edge. What the hell are they?" He said he could only make out 2 black blobs from the lip of the wall. That's about all I could see of them too. The house light had little effect this far out. He asked again, "What the hell is going on?" Just then, as I was clambering up the other back, the 2 creatures flew silently, except for the vocalizations, near my left ear, up the bank and right past my partner's shoulders, and out into the night. I have no idea what they were, and my partner, who is a wildlife veterinarian, had no clue. This is not fiction, and this description was from my corroborated memory. I can tell you, sleep was not in my immediate future, so I googled the history of the area, and sure enough, an old Indian legend of the crying voice in the woods luring young warriors to their death. I wanted to write to you because what I believe is that I had an encounter with a werewolf. I have no idea what else to call this thing that I saw. My dog sure reacted funny to it too, and my dog is a very well-behaved animal. It happened when I would go on evening runs with my dog in the summertime, since it starts to really cool down in the evening. It was really a night just like any other night where I ran my dog, headphones in and all. I don't run anywhere sketchy, just around my neighborhood. There are lots of trees, but no forests or anything. We're a pretty standard run-of-the-mill kind of neighborhood. I first noticed things were off because my dogs, well, they started acting strange. She began cowering at points throughout the run, and stopped to where I'd have to tug on her leash to get her to go. I thought the whole thing was so strange. Then as we're coming around the curve in the sidewalk, this werewolf steps out behind us. I'm running forward, hear something heavy step out from behind me, and I turn my head. My dog is already going crazy, and there's just this thing standing there. It was clear as day that you had somebody who was 8 feet tall get into a high-quality, ultra-realistic werewolf costume. It just stood there, out in the open, watching me run. I was in such shock. I knew it wasn't somebody in a costume. It felt real. It looked real. My mind just went blank because I couldn't fathom such an animal to be in the flesh, only 10 feet behind me. My legs didn't stop moving though. I kept on running, even though I'm somehow dragging my dog with me. Time itself slowed down, and I think I might have even blacked out a lot of it. It's like I got PTSD from it or something. I must have kept running, but my head turned, keeping a close eye on this thing. A mix between, what the fuck is that, and oh my god, is this even real? It never moved. It never tried to reach out and grab me or even touch me. It easily could have. It was within arm's reach of me, and it just stopped, and I ran until it was out of sight. I cut the run short, got home, and went on full house lockdown for 3 days after that. My dog wouldn't stop shaking and acting strange. And the next weeks, after I had horrible nightmares about this thing being outside my house and coming in to get me, I kept it at bay for only so long, but it didn't fully stop. It was all just really creepy. I didn't run for almost a month after the initial encounter. When I started again, I never ran the same route I did on that one evening where I ran into the creature. About 28 years ago, I knew an Apache woman who attended the same congregation I did, who told me about a pack of werewolves that she saw when she was a little girl on a Native American reservation in Arizona. She was a really nice person, a devout follower of Jesus, very honest, so her story was very credible to me. Here is what happened. One day, she went with her father to go visit another town on the res that was a few hours away. She said that because they had left late in the day, he decided they would stay in town for the night, since it was getting dark and he didn't want to drive at night. So he made a warm, comfortable bed for her in the bed of their pickup truck with some blankets they had in the truck. She said at some point, early in the morning, around 3 a.m., she woke up to hear shuffling, grunting, and growling near the truck. She said from where she was, under all the blankets, she could see them. A group of werewolves that were between 7 and 8 feet tall, covered with hair. She said they looked like the werewolf from the movie The Howling. Growing up on the res, she had heard the stories of Native American shamans who could shapeshift into these hideous creatures by opening themselves up to evil spirits. But now, in shock and terror, she was looking at them. She said she doesn't know if they were unaware that she was in the bed of the truck, or if they knew, but ignored her, but since she didn't move a muscle until they were gone. Many years reflecting on it, She was convinced that either way, the reason they didn't snatch her was that God was protecting her from them. In January of 2010, I was driving to LA after spending the holidays with family. I-40 the whole way. After a long day of driving, I stopped at Holbrook, Arizona to get a hotel for the night. I get the room, pull around to the back parking lot, and park my car. I open the back door and start to grab my bags and get my stuff together I was going to take inside for the night. All of a sudden, I hear a crazy sounding roar. The closest I can come to describing it is that it sounded like a mixture of a bear roaring, a pig squealing, and a baby crying. I freeze, look up, and standing on the edge of the raised parking lot next door was some kind of man-dog thing. It was probably around 7 to 8 feet tall. I look at it, it roars again, and I take off running towards my hotel room. I get to the door, scared shitless, fumbling with my key card, and it roars again like it's just to the left of me. I get the key in the door, lock the door, and run to the bathroom and lock that door too. I sat there for maybe 30 minutes. Then I grabbed my pillows and blankets off the bed and slept in the bathtub all night with the door locked. I started searching on my phone for what the hell that was and what it could have been, and that's when I learned about skinwalkers. If that exists, then what the hell else does that isn't supposed to? What was almost just as crazy is that when I bolted towards my room, I left my car unlocked and the doors wide open. They stayed open all night and nothing was taken or stolen, and I had a bunch of music equipment in there. But yeah, be careful on the edges of the Navajo reservation. When I was a young boy, my grandfather used to talk about all of the mysteries of a world. Back when I was around 7, my grandfather came down with cancer. He had been a smoker for most of his life, but he never really did it in front of me. So I was completely oblivious to the situation that was happening. He would sit me down and rock me and tell me all these stories about when the sun would talk to the moon and the birds were our friends and when we needed friends. But as I grew older, I asked deeper questions. Questions he would answer with, "It's not time for that." When I was 12, my grandfather passed away. My mother was the only child of my grandfather, and she was so broken by his passing, she never got rid of anything he had. During my sophomore year of high school, I was thinking about the things in the basement of my house, and I remember the feeling of digging through all of his dusty books and old pieces of clothing. The smell was something like bourbon, like an old shed of rotting wood. I got down to the last few items in the box, and I saw a blue book face down with my name on it. I grabbed it and opened the first page for it to read, "Dear Jesse, open when you are 16. There was a large S with lines through it on the third page. The book was telling me how to craft weapons for something. Nothing came to mind about the book, so I kept flipping and flipping. Then it was a picture, a tall figure with the dark skin and haunting lower jaw. It read Skinwalker, with a 23 on the right of it. I read the description of what it was and spooked when I got done. The numbers were the amount of Southwest that were killed, I think, or that he had seen. Did I go too far and find something worth sharing? This has left me feeling extremely shook, and I'd love some opinions, especially from somebody with experiences. Last year, I had a very strange experience in a national forest out in California. I was by myself on a road trip with my dog, and I was driving pretty far into the Mendocino National Forest. I like to camp in national parks and forests because it's isolated, so my dog can roam and they're free of charge. A trade-off for sketchy rough drives into the parks sometimes and a lack of service or assistance. Anyway, I was driving up this dirt road, kind of curling up a mountain, around maybe 5 p.m. It was very nice out, sunny and warm with a slight breeze. Nothing serious had happened, but I felt extremely uncomfortable driving into the area. That feeling did not let up. Driving up the mountain, I felt like I shouldn't stay there, and I even texted my boyfriend about it for as long as I could before my phone completely lost service. I was looking for a sign of another person, having been around the area lately, but didn't see anything. I pulled over and got out of my car with my dog to look over the edge, and noticed a dead squirrel and some broken glass mixed in with the dirt and gravel. Yuck. My dog starts to growl slightly. She is vocal, but I've almost only ever seen or heard her growl at other dogs. I did see her growl at a possum once, so it could be something she smelt, maybe. This place continued to make me feel quite on edge, but I pride myself in being an independent traveler and backpacker, so I decided to continue at least a bit further with my grumbling pup to see if I could find a good place to camp. I continued to notice more dead animals. Keep in mind, no one is going to be more than 5 to 10 miles up this thing, and that's if there's anyone even there. I hear men's voices. They sound so close and I think I should call out to them. So I stop my car and then kind of freeze up and feel like I shouldn't. I can't really make out what they're saying, and I don't see any signs of people anywhere. And so I get back in my car and continue to slowly drive forward and cautiously look for where any voices could be coming from. I've never ran into other people in a national park or forest when I've gone this deep in. The unsettling feeling grows about the voices, which have sort of come and gone a few times, and I give up and begin to turn my car around. I honestly don't remember how my dog was acting on the way down. I was scared and focused on getting out of there. I just distinctly remember being surprised at her grumbling when we were standing outside of my car. Kind of dangerously quickly, I went back down the mountain, not seeing a sign of anyone. I decided to spring for luxury and get a hotel for the night. I figured I was just fine. Huge and open spaces can be intimidating, I told myself, and the voices could have been echoing from somewhere far off, and they just sounded close. Animals die. Glass gets broken. Nothing happened. Cool. But I remember this place. It sticks with me. Whenever I'm watching scary movies, if I'm walking my dog in the woods at night, nothing compares to the feeling I had driving up that mountain, and it's honestly kind of interesting to me as well as frightening. I recently happened across some information as well as some Native American lore that made me feel extremely uneasy. Fast forward a year, I've mentioned this place to a few people and the haunting vibes it gave me, but nothing much more. Googled the national park once and didn't see anything, but didn't look much either. I like scary movies and things of that nature, hence my fascination with this, so my boyfriend and I were coming up on finishing our road trip just yesterday. There were only 2 to 3 hours left and the sun had set, so we decided to listen to some scary podcasts and YouTube videos. We went from the No Sleep podcast to the X-Files and ended up on a True Stories video dealing with a Native American lore. I'm half paying attention, petting my dog, and playing Pokemon, and I hear the narrator mention Wendigos. Very briefly says that they are and casually mentions that they can mimic voices. I mean it when I say the most horrible chills I have ever had in my life crawl down my spine. I stare at my boyfriend and ask him if he remembers that national forest that I was freaked out about last year. He says he does, and he reminds me that he texted me. I was probably close to a Wendigo. I remember him saying that, but didn't know much about their lore and thought he was just being funny, like, yeah, Bigfoot is probably stalking you, or some other dad joke. And he was like, no, I mean, I was mostly joking, but I said it specifically because you said you were hearing voices that you couldn't find a trace of. I feel strange, and I start Googling Wendigos, etc., etc. They are allegedly able to mimic human voices, and they would live up in that sort of area. It just all matched up. Obviously, there's a ton of questionable info out there, but I try to find more reputable websites and authentic experiences. I then specifically looked up missing persons in the area, and the first headline that catches my eye is, "Another family goes missing in Mendocino." And I went through different websites and news articles of people going missing, but they are all a little hidden underneath national park websites and pictures of trees. I remember looking up the forest about a year ago and didn't see anything, and realized that these stories didn't seem to be talked about too much, which also piqued my intuition. It was stated that well over 100 people in the past 8 years have gone missing and never been found, on top of many which were found dead. It just has my intuition super spiked. Remembering how unsafe I felt and how much I wanted to get out of there terrifies me. I felt so uneasy about what I was hearing, and to this day, my dog and I are very close. She was a stray that started following me one day, and I ended up bringing her home from Costa Rica. So her little growls along the way, which makes me feel like there was something wrong. Even though it was just a storytelling video, those stories originate from somewhere. I have done a lot of solo traveling, both in and out of the country, and I have never had such a bad feeling, on top of seeing an unnecessary amount of dead animals in a national forest, which just seems strange. I don't think I'll be doing any more solo traveling, unless it's around civilization. Myself and my brother both had separate encounters with it in the spring and fall of 1994, respectively. I first encountered something in the spring of 1994 when camping with a group of friends in the woods, bordered by Lyons Road to the west, the Florida Turnpike to the east, Sample Road to the south, and Winston Park Development to the north. I left the camp alone at about 1 a.m., heading east towards the turnpike on a trail. I began to hear what seemed to be footsteps in the wood, maybe 10 yards to my right. I'd also like to say that I smelt a musty odor, but I could be inserting that into the report. It's been a while since I had the encounter, and my recollection isn't as clear as I wish it were. Regardless, I continued to walk, and the footsteps were remaining parallel with mine. It became clear that whatever was to my right was walking on 2 feet from the stepping pattern. I started to get a little frightened because the area where the footsteps were coming from was a thicket of Brazilian peppers, difficult to walk through during the day and nearly impossible to manage in the night. I heard it move closer, and I turned around and walked briskly back to the camp. I woke my friends and we went back to find it, although it was gone at the time. I remember leaving with the impression that I had encountered a Sasquatch, which must be because of the musty scent, although I wrote it off as a figment of my imagination, that it must have been a farmer or vagrant in the woods. I proceeded to forget about the incident and never mentioned it again. About 6 months later, my brother was in the same woods, maybe a half mile from where I had my encounter, walking at night with a friend. He turned a corner from one trail to another, and Bigfoot was standing at the intersection of the 2 trails. He said that it had reached out for him, and he and his friend had ran off. He told me about the experience, and I then related mine. We had a running joke for a while that there was a monster in our backyard. I'd like to be able to have my brother provide his, since he had a sighting and is better and more credible than I am, but he passed away at the end of 1995. I believe I might be able to find the friend, however. Regardless, I wanted to report the incident for a few reasons. First, it's very unusual to encounter a creature like this in the area. That area is surrounded on all sides by a significant amount of development. While there remained a good deal of open land, including a tomato farm, a tree farm, Tradewinds Park, and some undeveloped land, it didn't strike me as being an area where one would have to thought to find a creature like this. There doesn't seem to be too terribly far for this thing to go without it being spotted. Further, given the amount of development that has gone into the area since, its range is becoming severely limited. Still, the 1975 Broward report happened about a mile or 2 west of where my brother and I saw it, so it must have found a way to adapt. It's possible it can move along the turnpike and the Sawgrass Expressway somewhat unnoticed, making it over the nearby landfill, as well as Quiet Waters Park, although it appears unlikely that it could have gone too much further without it being caught in the middle of suburbia. Given the amount of development that has since gone into the area, its range is further being restricted. It might be a very lucrative area to investigate. At the rate development is going, if it is still back there, It's going to be encroached upon sometime very soon. My girlfriend and I have been spending the last couple of summers in my parents' old stone house, which happens to be in the middle of the woods, but somehow equipped with all what one would need for a comfortable lifestyle. To give a little bit of an overview of what it's like on the inside, there is a front entrance leading up to a large living area, equipped with a bar and many other means of luxury, such as a cinema screen and a massive freezer for snacks and such. Then to the right, there are stairs leading to the main bedrooms, and to the left, there is a massive sliding glass door leading to the backyard and out into some more woods. With the slight inconvenience of the electricity generator slacking off every once in a while, timing at about 6 to 7 hours in between every crash, and when it does, we'd have to go outside and no matter the time of day to turn it back on, as everything in the house relies on electricity to run. One cold summer night, my girlfriend and I were about to fall asleep watching some random show on the TV when the power cut suddenly. Now, one thing I should mention is that right before we'd gotten ready to sleep, we got out just to turn it off and back on, so we don't have to do it in the middle of the night. Frustrated and having no choice but to get up and seek a fix for it, my girlfriend and I walked outside, embraced by the cold dark night, and out to the back of the house where the generator had been. However, from the moment I'd stood facing the sliding glass door and looked out the woods, my heart sank into the floor with an eerie feeling. Somehow, I felt like I was a little bunny, obliviously walking into a poorly prepared trap, but I'd mustered the courage to go outside and be embraced by the dark night. Right as we reached the generator, I'd realized I had forgotten the flashlight while trying to unlock the door, to which my girlfriend suggested I run and fetch it while she waits, which I agreed to, my body craving sleep and the comfort of the house. I ran back on the familiar path, a feeling of dread growing in the pit of my stomach as I neared the house, and right as I faced the massive glass door, I realized why. There was someone, or something, standing right in the center of the living area. It had the features of a stray dog, eyes beaming with red, and foam, what seemed to be leaking from its mouth, as it growled aggressively at me. But it was the farthest thing from being a dog. It was standing on 2 legs, and twice the size of a fairly intimidating man. I froze, my body and exhausted mind teaming up to nail me to the ground as this creature got near me in a zombie-like walk, trying to balance on its own 2 feet. I felt the hairs on my neck rise as it walked closer to me, sniffing the air around me like a starving dog, hungrily waiting for their next meal. The fear rising until it clicked in my head, and something just told me to make a run for it. I ran as fast as I could to get to my girlfriend's, and out of breath, I tried to explain to her why I was so desperate to distance us from the house before I saw the colors be drained from her face as she stared out into the void behind me. She snatched my arm, and we just ran into the woods, hearing as this creature neared us, feeling as if its paws were seconds from collapsing with my feet. I don't know what I feared most, looking behind and having it devour my face, or freezing out of fear as I did earlier. Choosing not to look around, I shouted to my girlfriend to run back around the house, which was a close distance from where we were. Fueled by the fear and sound of the approaching creature, we ran inside and locked the door as I noticed the beast had stopped at the front gate. Puzzled by its strange behavior, my girlfriend and I failed to take in a second of sleep as we listened carefully to its growling and walking around the property like it was playing some sort of sick game. And somehow, the hours stretched to years as we waited there for the sun to rise. As soon as the sun rose and we noticed the path to the truck was clear, we hightailed it out of that house and promised to never go back there. Although no one really believes the story, as even we don't quite know what we had encountered that night, I suppose the name Dogman rings well on it. So, needless to say, I'm never going back to that place so I hope I can stay as far away from it as I can.